Just stop you there.
Yeah.
Is this Grant, like, got money involved or whatever?
Class identity is a crucial aspect of Spider-Man because it's one of the pillars in his entire artistic construction. It's what makes him distinctly an underdog in a genre populated by gods, super soldiers, aliens, and billionaires. Because whatever happens, at the end of the day, Peter Parker has to worry about being fired from work. He's shaped by factors related to his social conditions. But I think one of the leniencies from shared continuities from comics that hasn't been completely translated into film is seeing how social connections not affecting living conditions. Social conditions defined by PIERRE Bourdieu is dependent on three forms of capitals: economic capital, which is wealth and income; social capital, which are contacts and connections; cultural capital, which is the ability to appreciate and engage in cultural goods.
Oh my gosh, opera glasses!
So cute!
Cultural capital isn't really a component to Spider-Man. We don't really have stories where he sits around watching the opera or reading literature from the canon or something. But economic capital and social capital are fundamentally important tensions in Spider-Man's sense of self-concept, because his stories are often grounded by these concerns. In fact, in his first standalone issue, famously it's focused on Spider-Man trying to join the Fantastic Four in order to make some money, but comic book continuity is relaxed, fluid, and is negotiated by multiple decades of simply accepting the creative pick-and-choose logic of the medium, and this need to hold a sense of fidelity towards the status quo. Why is there a f***ing helicopter above my house? You Get out, leave! In comics, you just accept that Peter Parker can barely pay his rent, even though the sheer magnitude of all his social connections would give him a billion of other opportunities to live a better life than that. Whereas I would predict movie audiences would probably be really put off watching a kid go through poverty and other undesirable social conditions after previously fighting side by side with Iron Man, because that adjustable proximity between characters and how creatively sovereign they can suddenly be isn't really a normalized storytelling effect in film, since storytelling in movies demand a level of tightness in terms of causality that is just more relaxed in superhero comics. So unless the MCU version of Spider-Man was going to exist purely in isolation, they would have to directly address how his social capital would immediately compensate his economic disadvantages. Simply knowing Iron Man would benefit this Spider-Man from ever needing to deliver pizzas ever. So this requires the Marvel Studio version of Spider-Man to be completely re-artistically interpreted, and what's fascinating is that where the Sam Raimi films committed to exploring the uncomfortable nuances of how economics affects social conditions,
Sorry doesn't pay the rent.
And don't try to sneak past me. I have ears like a cat and eyes like a rodent.
Marvel Studios has gone the other direction in order to explore how social connections can affect social conditions. But I'm getting ahead of myself.
They're not stopping.
Alright, so even though Spider-Man in Civil War was pretty famously a last-minute decision, his introduction is actually unbelievably smartly designed, because unlike before, they have to introduce how he's a dot in a network of other dots as opposed to being the central point that everything else spirals out of. So introducing this Spider-Man through the eyes of Tony Stark without being jarring or awkward about it completely justifies the different existential identity for him.
You got hard, kid. Where you from?
Queens!
Brooklyn.
Recognizable characteristics like him being poor,
Thrift store? Salvation Army?
The garbage actually.
You're a dumpster diver.
Yeah, I was...
smart,
Who manufactured that?
I did.
prone to worrying about Aunt May are all established to reassure the audience that despite this being an unavoidably simplified version of Peter Parker, he's still the character we know. And what I mean by simplify is that the moment when you put Spider-Man in a group with other characters that are equally functional protagonists, he has to have an immediately easier to understand personality role that can stimulate conversational diversity and collective problem solving.
Like in Footloose, the movie?
Exactly like Footloose.
They can't make him this shy, tragically complex, poor, sad man filled with regrets that is written to specifically creatively prosper in small, intimate dramas like in the Raimi films. He'll be fighting Thanos soon enough. So similar to the comics, they gave Spider-Man a more authentic, louder personality, a quippy, easy to understand, fun-loving dude, eager to impress, that is reluctant at times, but is ultimately enthusiastic nonetheless. So going all the way back to this introduction, the foundations are so brilliantly laid out because without ever hitting you over the head, the mode of address of the scene won most of the audience over before he even put on the costume. So Spider-Man in Civil War isn't just about establishing this version of Spider-Man, but it's also about transitioning him.
What are you hiding, Peter? Spider-Man Homecoming is bizarrely almost meta in the way it's constructed, not just because there's a scene where Spider-Man is trying to save a sinking ship until the mess is fixed by Iron Man being Kevin Feige and the sinking ship being Sony, but the entire focus on Spider-Man's need to be involved with the more famous characters, while this impulse clashes with his independent identity that is built firmly on separate foundations, is exactly what the studio is having to deal with in terms of establishing this version of Spider-Man's creative individuality, and yet implicit brand involvement to something that is far more famous now. And they've negotiated Spider-Man's individuality by directly recontextualizing his identity and class. Similar to my essay about the Sam Raimi trilogy, in Homecoming, Peter Parker's arc revolves around the familiar struggles of the self-concept. His ideal self is Iron Man, and his self-image isn't equal to Iron Man, but in reality he's not really ready yet, and should stick to being Spider-Man, so his self-esteem has to be tempered before he can grow up. Broadly speaking, it's like Peter Parker's arc in Spider-Man 1, in the sense that it's a coming-of-age tale about humility, but this time his ideal self isn't someone who's wealthy and has a car, but is his identification to another character.
I just wanted to be like you.
And I wanted you to be better.
Which is immediately artistically jarring for a lot of people, especially for fans who mainly love Spider-Man because of the Sam Raimi trilogy, where he's a film character before he's a comic book character. So Marvel Studios seemingly structured the central plot to directly diffuse and confront this issue as much as they can. Toomes and Peter have effectively mirrored arcs and journeys. They both start out as working class people whose lives are impacted by Tony Stark, and then they proceed to live their lives in shadow of him, where everything they do is in their minds a response to him. But they also move up the class hierarchy, but still engage in the working class environment. Vulture lives in an expensive designer house with a designer kitchen, but sells weapons to criminals to be used in poor neighborhoods, and Peter Parker is set for life, but is still your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, helping old ladies and stuff. They're both characters where being working class is effectively a rhetoric rather than a set of conditions that they live in. But the movie negotiates this change with the audience by showing how the sincerity of Spider-Man's rhetoric works through juxtaposing how insincere Toomes is. In other words, Marvel Studios' version of Spider-Man is a working class hero because he loves his environment, rather than being trapped by it. It's the polar opposite to Sam Raimi's interpretation, which is kind of interesting. What the If Civil War was about transitioning, Homecoming was about renegotiating, then Far From Home is about mining this version of Spider-Man, because it's the first movie to completely and confidently explore what this version of Spider-Man has as opposed to what he doesn't, which is the drama associated from simply knowing people.
You sent Nick Fury to voicemail?
I gotta go.
You do not ghost Nick Fury!
Mysterio as a villain is literally a creation from a network of people that suffer from the symbolic inequality of being under Tony Stark's reputational shadow. Even though they're geniuses who probably got paid loads because being underpaid isn't the motivation that's referred to, it's all about where they fit in terms of recognition and purpose. Peter Parker has a similar struggle where simply being socially acquainted with people like Nick Fury puts his life under conditions that are immediately out of his control. His self-concept is being pulled apart in two different directions. But I think Far From Home and Identity Theory is an essay for another time, so check that out when that happens. But another aspect from Far From Home that I think is kind of interesting is the way it continues to solidify the new artistic boundaries to what this Spider-Man is shaped by. Mysterio, like Vulture, are villains that are shaped by a sense of world-building utility. In other words, they help explain the world from the perspective of the periphery. Who cleans up the mess? Who helped invent this? And what happened to the guy that got shouted at?
Tony Stark was able to build this in a cave!
There are antagonists that aren't the externalized demons from Peter Parker's sense of self, like in the Sam Raimi trilogy, where it was all about his duality, his idealization, or his insulated sense of grandiosity. This Peter Parker is more affected by external forces than his previous outings. The lesson learned here, I guess, is that when you change a character by giving them relationships that they previously didn't have in other representations, you can't just forcefully attach them on like it was always there. you always have to commit and do the hard work in reinventing the mechanics. Connections changes everything. It unavoidably alters the scope and reorientates just about everything about the character. Simply knowing the right people and being networked into a specific group can change the conditions of your entire life. That's why in university they always f***ing advertise and talk about networking events, so this Spider-Man is constructed to fit into these radically different conditions, and I think they did a pretty good job at it.
Lost a Stark internship. What?
I liked Homecoming well enough, and surprisingly really loved Far From Home, but it's a bittersweet sort of love. It's sweet because Tom Holland is just utterly perfect as Spider-Man, and I love how we have Spider-Man movies that are comedies first and dramas seconds for a change, especially after 5 films, but it's better because we won't get the soap opera from the comics. And after a series focused on Mary Jane and then another series focused on Gwen Stacy, we're still not going to get to see them both in one complex story, or a truly authentic, confident, bubbly Mary Jane who chased Peter Parker around. We probably won't see Gwen Stacy or Harry Osborn ever again, or at least in an accurate way. We won't see Peter Parker work in the Daily Bugle with his relationship with Robbie Robinson and a classic Betty Brant, probably ever. Or see this sweet kid stress about looking after his elderly aunt, which was an aspect of the character that I particularly latched onto as a kid because my own parents had me when they're quite old. But at the same time, New Horizons are here to tell Spider-Man stories that's never even been close to being touched before. And we've already stepped a foot into that world where Spider-Man can participate in stories about intergalactic events or gigantic time-traveling battles. When the Fantastic Four joins the MCU, it's only a matter of time till we'll see the Human Torch rivalry. And when the X-Men join, we'll have the fun Wolverine and Spidey opposites attract buddy relationship. We can go as cosmic as we want, and we can go as small as we want. And if they keep going as they plan, we can see this kid grow up before our very eyes. We can see him get married, become a school teacher, and so forth. As long as Sony doesn't take him back. So I'm not sure about you, but I'm still pretty goddamn excited.